When the quiet janitor everyone ignored stepped into the most powerful room in the building, no one expected her to change everything, and certainly no one expected what she was about to say. The elevators opened with a soft chime on the executive floor of Sterling and Rowe Financial, a place where decisions worth millions of dollars were made before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Polished marble floors reflected the morning light, and the faint scent of expensive cologne and fresh paper lingered in the air. Executives moved quickly, voices low but confident, their tailored suits signaling authority long before they spoke. And yet, among all that motion, all that noise, there was someone no one noticed. Her name was Clara Bennett. She moved quietly, pushing a worn but neatly organized cleaning cart down the hallway, her gray uniform pressed, her expression calm, almost unreadable. To most people in the building, Clara was background, a necessary presence but never a meaningful one. She wiped fingerprints from glass walls, emptied trash bins filled with crumpled drafts of million-dollar ideas, and occasionally nodded politely when someone happened to make eye contact, which was rare. It had been that way for years. Clara had learned early on that invisibility came with its own strange kind of safety. When people do not see you, they do not filter themselves around you. They speak freely. They reveal things they should not. And Clara listened. She always listened. That morning felt no different, at least on the surface. The office buzzed with anticipation for the upcoming quarterly board meeting, one that insiders whispered would determine the future direction of the entire company. Promotions, layoffs, restructuring, all of it would be decided behind closed doors. Clara paused briefly near the conference room, adjusting the handle of her cart as voices spilled into the hallway. Laughter. Confident, careless laughter. Someone inside joked about trimming departments like pruning dead branches from a tree. Another voice responded with amusement, mentioning how easy it was to replace people who complained too much. Clara's hands remained steady, but her grip tightened just slightly. She had heard variations of those conversations before. Over time they had layered themselves into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Still she said nothing. She never said anything. Instead she moved on, continuing her work with the same quiet precision she always carried. To anyone watching, she was just doing her job. But what no one in that building knew, what no one had ever even considered, was that Clara Bennett was not just the janitor who cleaned their offices. She was the one person who had the power to tear the entire structure down if she chose to. And after years of watching, listening, and waiting, that choice was closer than anyone could possibly imagine. Clara Bennett had long ago stopped expecting kindness from the people who worked at Sterling and Rowe, but that did not mean she had stopped noticing the way they treated others. In fact, the longer she stayed invisible, the more she saw. The patterns were always the same, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss if you were not paying close attention. A dismissive tone here, an interrupted sentence there. A meeting where the loudest voice was rewarded instead of the most capable one. But over time, those small moments revealed something much larger, something woven deeply into the culture of the company itself. Clara moved from office to office that morning, her cart rolling softly across the floor, her presence barely acknowledged. In one corner office, two senior associates discussed a recent project, not in terms of its success but in terms of who would take credit for it. One of them laughed, casually suggesting they let a junior analyst carry the blame if anything went wrong. In another office, a manager scolded his assistant for a minor scheduling error, his voice sharp and unnecessarily harsh, as if authority required volume to be valid. Clara kept her head down, wiping surfaces that would be dusty again by the end of the day, but her mind recorded everything. She did not need to write it down. She never forgot. The deeper she moved into the executive wing, the more obvious the divide became. The higher the position, the less concern there seemed to be for the people beneath it. Conversations shifted from collaboration to control, from problem-solving to profit protection. It was not just ambition. It was something colder, something calculated. And at the center of it all was Daniel Mercer, the chief executive officer of Sterling and Rowe. Daniel had built a reputation as a visionary, a man who could turn struggling departments into profit engines and transform market uncertainty into opportunity. But inside the company, his leadership told a different story. He ruled with precision and pressure, measuring people not by their effort or integrity, but by their immediate output. If you delivered results, you were valuable. If you did not, you were replaceable. Clara had seen him in action more times than she could count. She remembered one particular afternoon when a young analyst named Tyler accidentally presented outdated numbers during a team briefing. It was a small mistake, easily corrected, but Daniel did not treat it that way. His voice cut through the room, sharp and unforgiving, questioning Tyler's competence in front of everyone. The room had gone silent, not out of respect but out of fear. Clara had been in the corner, cleaning the glass wall, invisible as always. She watched Tyler's shoulders tense, watched the way he struggled to maintain composure, and watched as no one stepped in to support him. That was how the system worked. Survival meant silence. Over the years, Clara had also noticed something else, something that disturbed her even more than the open displays of authority. It was the quiet decisions, the ones made behind closed doors. Budget cuts that somehow never affected the executive bonuses. Layoffs that targeted the most vulnerable departments. Complaints filed with human resources that seemed to disappear without resolution. There was a pattern to it, a deliberate reshaping of the company that prioritized profit above all else, even basic fairness. One evening, as Clara finished her shift later than usual, she overheard a conversation that stayed with her longer than the others. Two directors were in the lounge, speaking freely, unaware that anyone was nearby. They joked about an upcoming round of layoffs, not as a difficult decision, but as a strategic advantage. One of them remarked that cutting staff before the next earnings report would make the numbers look stronger. The other laughed and added that most of those employees would never see it coming anyway. Clara stood just outside the doorway, her hand resting against the frame, her expression unchanged. But inside something shifted. It was no longer just observation. It was no longer something she could quietly file away and move past. These were not just decisions on paper. They were choices that would affect real people, families, lives that extended far beyond the walls of this building. And for the first time in a long time, Clara Bennett felt the weight of everything she had seen begin to settle into something else. A notebook that had remained mostly untouched for years. She opened it slowly, her fingers pausing for just a second before she began to write. At first the words came cautiously. Names, dates, observations. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. But as the pages filled, something shifted. The structure of what she had witnessed began to take shape, not as isolated incidents but as a system. A system that could be understood. A system that, if understood well enough, could be challenged. Clara was not reckless. She knew that acting without preparation would accomplish nothing. So she did what she had always done best. She continued to watch. But now her watching had purpose. She paid closer attention to schedules, noting when key executives met, and who attended those meetings. She listened more carefully to the tone behind conversations, distinguishing between confidence and insecurity, between strategy and improvisation. She noticed which documents were treated casually, and which ones were handled with care. And slowly, almost without anyone realizing it, Clara Bennett began to connect pieces that had never been meant to be seen together. There were moments, small but significant, that hinted at something deeper beneath her calm exterior. A hesitation before entering certain rooms, a slight pause when particular names were mentioned, a look, brief but unmistakable, that suggested she understood far more than anyone assumed. Still she revealed nothing. Not yet. Because Clara knew that timing mattered as much as truth. And somewhere beneath her quiet routine, beneath the steady rhythm of her work, there was a certainty growing stronger with each passing day. The moment to act was coming. And when it did, it would not be quiet. It would not be invisible. It would be undeniable. The shift from observation to action did not arrive with a sudden decision. It came through a moment that Clara Bennett could not ignore. A moment that transformed everything she had quietly endured into something that demanded response. It happened on a Thursday evening, long after most of the office lights had dimmed and the building had settled into its usual after-hours stillness. Clara was finishing her routine in the executive lounge, carefully wiping down a glass table that had hosted countless private conversations, when she heard voices approaching from the hallway. Instinctively, she moved toward the side entrance, not to hide, but simply out of habit, giving space the way she always had. The door remained slightly open, just enough for the voices to carry clearly into the room. Two senior partners entered, their tone relaxed, their posture loose in a way that only came when they believed no one important was around. They poured themselves drinks, the soft clink of glass echoing lightly as their conversation unfolded without restraint. At first, it sounded like any other discussion about performance metrics and projections, but the direction shifted quickly. They began talking about an upcoming restructuring plan, one that had not yet been announced. Entire departments would be reduced, positions eliminated. The language they used was efficient, almost clinical, but the meaning was unmistakable. One of them laughed, remarking how easy it had become to package layoffs as strategic optimization. The other responded by saying that most employees would never understand the difference anyway, that as long as the numbers looked strong, no one on the outside would question the costs behind them. Clara stood still, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the door. Her breathing remained steady, her expression unchanged, but something inside her shifted in a way it never had before. This was not a mistake. This was not pressure leading to poor decisions. This was intentional, deliberate, calculated. And for the first time, Clara felt something stronger than patience. She felt certainty. When the partners left, their conversation trailing off into the hallway, Clara did not move right away. The room felt different now, as if the quiet itself had taken on a new weight. She looked around slowly, taking in the space with a clarity that went beyond routine. Every surface she had cleaned, every room she had entered, every conversation she had overheard, it all pointed to the same conclusion. Nothing was going to change unless someone forced it to. Later that night, Clara returned home as she always did, but her routine did not follow its usual pattern. Instead of preparing dinner or turning on the television, she went directly to the small desk near her window. The notebook she had started days earlier lay exactly where she had left it, its pages already filled with observations and connections that no one else had pieced together. She sat down, opened it, and began writing again, this time with a clarity that removed any remaining hesitation. Names were no longer just notes. They were part of a structure. Decisions were no longer isolated. They were evidence. And as the hours passed, Clara's understanding of the company transformed into something far more precise. But there was something else, something she had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. Because everything she was writing, everything she was preparing, was not just based on what she had seen. It was supported by something far more significant. Something that gave her the authority to do more than expose the truth. It gave her the ability to change it. Clara paused for a moment, her pen resting against the page as her gaze shifted toward a small drawer built into the desk. It remained closed, untouched, but its presence was not accidental. Inside it were documents she had kept hidden for years. Documents that connected her to Sterling and Rowe in a way no one inside the company would ever suspect. She did not open the drawer. Not yet. But the fact that she considered it, even for a moment, was enough to confirm what she had already begun to accept. She was no longer just preparing to understand the system. She was preparing to confront it. And when she did, the truth would not come quietly. It would come with the kind of authority that could not be ignored, no matter how invisible she had once been. For years, Clara Bennett had carried a truth that no one inside Sterling and Rowe had ever come close to discovering, not because it was impossible to find, but because no one had ever thought to look in her direction. To them, she existed only within the narrow boundaries of her role, defined entirely by the uniform she wore and the tasks she performed. That assumption had protected her, allowed her to move freely, to observe without suspicion, to learn without interference. But the truth was far more complex, and far more powerful, than anything they could have imagined. It had begun long before Clara ever pushed a cleaning cart through the halls of the company. Years earlier, her husband, Richard Bennett, had been one of the earliest investors in Sterling and Rowe, quietly acquiring shares during a time when the firm was still finding its footing. Richard had never been interested in public recognition. He believed in long-term vision, in building something sustainable rather than something immediately visible. Over time, his investments grew, not dramatically at first but steadily, consistently, until his holdings represented a significant portion of the company. When Richard passed away unexpectedly, the entirety of his stake transferred to Clara. At the time, she had not fully understood what that meant. The documents had been explained to her in technical language, percentages, voting rights, influence, but none of it had felt real. She had not seen herself as someone who belonged in boardrooms or financial discussions. She had been focused on simpler things, maintaining stability, continuing forward. And so, rather than stepping into a visible role, she made a decision that no one questioned because no one noticed. She stayed where she was. She took a position inside the company, not as an executive or an investor, but as someone no one would ever consider significant. It had not been part of a grand strategy at the beginning. It had been instinct, a way to remain close to something she did not yet understand. But over time, that instinct revealed itself as something far more effective than any formal position could have been. Because while executives relied on reports and filtered information, Clara had access to reality. She saw how decisions were made, not how they were presented. She heard conversations before they were polished, before they were adjusted to fit narratives. She witnessed the direct impact of policies on the people who were never mentioned in official summaries. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand the full extent of the power she held. Not just the legal authority attached to her shares, but the informational advantage that came from being overlooked. By the time she sat at her desk that night, staring at the closed drawer that held the documents connecting her to Sterling and Rowe, there was no uncertainty left. She knew exactly what those papers represented. They were not just proof of ownership. They were leverage, control, the ability to influence decisions at the highest level, to call for votes, to challenge leadership, to restructure the direction of the company itself. Clara reached for the drawer and opened it slowly, her movements deliberate, steady. Inside, neatly organized, were the original share certificates, legal confirmations, and correspondence that traced the history of Richard's investment and its transfer to her. She lifted one of the documents carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar lines that confirmed what she had carried quietly for so long. Majority shareholder. The words had once felt distant, almost abstract. Now they felt precise, defined, real. Clara set the document back down and closed the drawer, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty. She did not need to look at them again. She knew what they said. She knew what they meant. And more importantly, she knew what she was going to do with them. For the first time since she had walked through the doors of Sterling and Rowe, Clara Bennett was no longer just watching the system from within. She was preparing to take control of it. And when that moment arrived, the people who had built their authority on the assumption that she was invisible would be forced to confront a reality they had never considered. The person they had overlooked for years was the one person who could change everything. Once Clara Bennett allowed herself to fully accept the power she held, everything around her began to look different, not in appearance but in meaning. The same hallways, the same conversations, the same routines all remained unchanged on the surface, but beneath that surface, every detail became part of a larger strategy. She was no longer simply witnessing the inner workings of Sterling and Rowe. She was mapping them. Timing became one of her most valuable tools. Clara paid close attention to the rhythm of the company, the predictable cycles of meetings, reporting periods, and executive check-ins. She learned when decisions were discussed informally, and when they were formalized. She noted which executives influenced outcomes behind the scenes, and which ones followed the direction of others. Patterns that once seemed incidental now formed a structure she could anticipate with precision. Information, however, was the foundation of everything. Clara understood that authority alone would not be enough. If she was going to challenge the leadership, she would need undeniable proof, something that could not be dismissed, ignored, or reinterpreted. And so she began to collect it, carefully and ethically, never taking anything that did not belong to her, but paying attention to everything that was left in plain sight. Documents left on desks. Printed reports placed in shared areas. Conversations held too openly by those who believed no one was listening. Each piece on its own might not have meant much, but together they formed a clear, an undeniable picture of how the company truly operated. Late in the evenings, Clara would return home and organize what she had learned, transferring details from memory into structured notes. Names were connected to decisions. Decisions were connected to outcomes. Outcomes were connected to consequences that had never been publicly acknowledged. The process required patience, but patience was something Clara had mastered long ago. She did not rush. She did not assume. She verified. But Clara knew she could not do this alone. There were elements of the system that required expertise beyond observation, legal frameworks, financial analysis, and corporate governance rules that would determine how her authority could be exercised effectively. Reaching out was not an easy decision. It required trust, something she did not give lightly. But there were a few people from her past, individuals who had known Richard, who understood the nature of his investments and the principles he had valued. Clara contacted them one by one, explaining only what was necessary, sharing carefully selected information to illustrate the situation without exposing more than she needed to. Among them was Jonathan Hale, a corporate attorney with a reputation for integrity, and Melissa Grant, a financial analyst who had once worked within firms like Sterling and Rowe before choosing a different path. Together, they helped Clara refine what she had already begun. Jonathan reviewed the legal standing of her shares, confirming what she already suspected but needed to hear with certainty. Her position was not symbolic. It was controlling. With the right approach, she had the authority to call for a board review, to challenge executive leadership, and to initiate a vote that could remove the CEO if supported by sufficient evidence. Melissa focused on the financial side, analyzing the patterns Clara had identified and translating them into clear, structured insights that would be understood at the highest level. What Clara had observed intuitively, Melissa confirmed with data. The company's success, while real on paper, had been achieved through decisions that carried hidden costs that could not remain hidden once properly presented. As the days passed, Clara's plan evolved from a collection of ideas into a coordinated strategy. Timing, evidence, legal authority, and presentation all needed to align. The upcoming quarterly board meeting provided the perfect opportunity. It was a moment when all key decision-makers would be present, when discussions about performance and direction would already be taking place, when the introduction of new information could not easily be postponed or dismissed. Clara knew that walking into that room would require more than preparation. It would require composure. She began to rehearse, not dramatically, not in front of others, but quietly, in the same controlled manner she approached everything else. She practiced how she would speak, how she would present the information, how she would respond to resistance. Because she knew there would be resistance. People do not give up power easily, especially when they believe it belongs to them. But Clara was no longer uncertain. She was no longer waiting for the right moment to appear. She had created it. And as the day of the board meeting drew closer, there was a clarity in her actions that had never been there before. She was not stepping into something unknown. She was stepping into something she had been preparing for longer than anyone realized. And when that moment came, it would not be about proving who she was. It would be about proving what they had chosen to ignore. The morning of the quarterly board meeting arrived with an air of confidence that moved through Sterling and Rowe like a quiet current, steady, assured, and completely unaware of what was about to disrupt it. Executives walked through the halls with measured purpose, their conversations filled with projections, expectations, and the kind of certainty that comes from believing everything is under control. The boardroom on the top floor had been prepared hours in advance, its long polished table reflecting the soft overhead lighting, its glass walls framing a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was a space designed to communicate authority, and everyone who entered it carried themselves accordingly. Clara Bennett arrived just as she always did, pushing her cart down the hallway, her presence blending seamlessly into the background of the morning routine. No one questioned her. No one looked twice. To them, she was simply part of the environment, as constant and unremarkable as the furniture itself. Inside the boardroom, the meeting had already begun. Daniel Mercer sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but commanding, his voice steady as he guided the discussion through performance metrics and forward strategy. Around him, the board members listened, occasionally interjecting with questions or affirmations, their attention focused entirely on the information being presented. Clara entered quietly, placing a tray of water glasses along the side table as she had done countless times before. The conversation continued without interruption. For a moment, everything followed the expected pattern. And then it changed. Clara did not leave. She remained where she stood, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the cart, her gaze directed toward the table. It was a small deviation, almost insignificant, but it was enough to be noticed. One of the board members glanced in her direction, his expression shifting slightly with confusion. Daniel paused mid-sentence, his eyes moving toward her with mild irritation. There was a brief silence, not long enough to disrupt the flow of the meeting, but long enough to register that something was different. Daniel leaned back slightly, his tone controlled but dismissive. He asked if there was something she needed to take care of, implying without saying it directly that she was out of place. Clara met his gaze, her expression calm, her voice steady when she responded. She said that there was, and that it concerned the meeting itself. The room shifted again, this time more noticeably. The assumption that she did not belong in the conversation collided with the fact that she was now part of it. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not yet concerned but no longer indifferent. He suggested that whatever she needed could be handled later, his words polite on the surface but carrying the expectation that she would step aside. Clara did not move. Instead, she reached into her cart and removed a folder, placing it gently on the table. The sound was soft, but in the quiet of the room it carried weight. The board members looked at it, then at her, their expressions moving from confusion to curiosity. Daniel's patience thinned. He asked what she thought she was doing, his tone sharper now, the authority in his voice more pronounced. Clara did not react to the shift. She opened the folder slowly, her movements deliberate, revealing documents that had been carefully organized, each page placed with intention. She began to speak, not loudly, but with a clarity that filled the room more effectively than volume ever could. She spoke about patterns, about decisions that had been made without full transparency, about actions that had prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability. She did not accuse recklessly. She presented each statement supported by evidence, each claim connected to something tangible, something that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding. First, the reaction was resistance. Daniel attempted to interrupt, to redirect, to reassert control over the situation. But the more Clara spoke, the more difficult it became to do so. Because what she was presenting was not opinion. It was structure. It was proof. The board members began to lean forward, their attention shifting away from Daniel and toward the documents in front of them. Questions emerged, not directed at Clara, but at the information itself. The room, once firmly under Daniel's control, began to change. And Clara had not even reached the most important part yet. She paused, just briefly, allowing the weight of what she had already said to settle. Then she looked directly at Daniel, her expression unchanged, her voice just as steady as before, and prepared to say the one thing that would redefine everything in that room. The room had already shifted, but what came next would redefine it entirely. Clara Bennett allowed a brief silence to settle, not as hesitation but as control. Every eye in the boardroom was now on her, not because of who they thought she was, but because of what she had just presented. The documents on the table had already begun to unravel the certainty that had filled the room only moments before. Daniel Mercer remained seated at the head, his posture still composed, but the confidence behind it was no longer absolute. He leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but edged with impatience, asking her to explain what exactly she believed she was doing. It was not a question born from curiosity. It was an attempt to regain control. Clara met his gaze without resistance, without aggression, and without the need to raise her voice. She explained that what she was doing was not a belief but an action. Then, with the same calm precision she had carried through every moment of her work, she placed one final document on the table, separate from the others. It was not a report. It was not a summary. It was a legal confirmation. The board members closest to it glanced down instinctively, their expressions tightening as they read the heading. Ownership structure. Share distribution. Voting authority. The language was clear, formal, and impossible to misinterpret. Clara spoke again, this time not about patterns or decisions but about position. She stated her name fully, Clara Bennett, and then she stated something no one in that room had ever considered. She was the majority shareholder of Sterling and Rowe. The words did not land all at once. They moved through the room in stages, first as confusion, then as disbelief, and finally as realization. One of the board members reached for the document, scanning it more carefully, his expression shifting as the details confirmed what had just been said. Another followed, and then another, each one finding the same conclusion. The structure of authority they had operated under was incomplete. There had always been another layer, one that had never been visible because no one had thought to look for it. Daniel's composure fractured, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. He leaned back, his expression tightening as he processed the information, searching for an angle, a flaw, something that could be challenged. He questioned the validity of the claim, the timing, the relevance, but each attempt met the same obstacle. The documentation was legitimate. The authority was real. And the timing was entirely within Clara's control. She did not rush. She did not press. She simply allowed the facts to exist in the room, undeniable and complete. Then she spoke again, and this time, her words were not an explanation. They were a decision. She stated that as the majority shareholder, she was initiating a formal review of executive leadership, effective immediately. She outlined the grounds clearly, referencing the evidence already presented, connecting it directly to the responsibilities held by the chief executive officer. There was no emotion in her delivery, no trace of personal conflict, only clarity. Then she said the words that ended everything Daniel Mercer had built within that room. She informed him that his position as CEO was being terminated, subject to board confirmation, which she had the authority to call for at that very moment. The silence that followed was absolute. Not uncertain, not confused, but complete. Because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. The balance of power had shifted, not gradually, not partially, but entirely. The person they had overlooked, dismissed, and ignored for years was now the one defining the outcome of the meeting. Daniel attempted to respond, to argue, to reassert control, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. The foundation it had relied on was gone. The board members, one by one, began to engage with Clara, not as an interruption, but as the central authority in the room. Questions were asked, confirmations were made, and within a matter of minutes, the process she had initiated moved forward with a speed that surprised even those who had once believed themselves to be in control. The vote, when it came, was not chaotic. It was procedural, structured, final. And when the result was confirmed, Daniel Mercer was no longer the CEO of Sterling and Rowe. Security was notified. The transition was set in motion. And Clara Bennett, who had entered the room as someone no one noticed, now stood as the most powerful person in it, not because she had demanded attention, but because she had revealed the truth that had always been there. The aftermath of the boardroom decision moved through Sterling and Rowe faster than any official announcement could contain. By the next morning, the news had reached every corner of the building, carried through quiet conversations, hurried whispers, and expressions that shifted from disbelief to cautious curiosity. The same people who had once walked past Clara Bennett without a second glance now found themselves speaking her name with a different tone, one that carried recognition, and in some cases regret. But Clara did not seek acknowledgement. She did not pause to absorb the reaction. From the moment the decision had been finalized, her focus had already shifted to what came next. Removing a leader was only the beginning. What mattered was what replaced the system that had allowed that leadership to exist in the first place. Clara returned to the building not as a symbol, but as an active presence. She moved through the same hallways, but this time she was no longer invisible. People stepped aside, conversations quieted as she passed, not out of fear, but out of awareness. The shift in perception was immediate, but Clara did not let it define her actions. She carried the same composure, the same measured pace, the same clarity she had always maintained. The difference was not in who she had become. It was in what others had finally recognized. The first changes she implemented were not dramatic, but they were deliberate. She began with transparency. Departments were required to document decision-making processes clearly, ensuring that actions could be traced, understood, and questioned if necessary. Financial reports were reviewed with a level of scrutiny that had not existed before, not to restrict growth, but to ensure that growth was not achieved at the expense of integrity. Human resources, once a quiet extension of executive decisions, was restructured to function independently, with external oversight introduced to prevent internal bias from silencing legitimate concerns. These changes did not happen all at once. They were introduced carefully, each step supported by reasoning, each decision communicated with clarity. Clara understood that rebuilding trust required consistency, not speed. But she also knew that certain issues could not wait. Compensation structures were reviewed, and adjustments were made where discrepancies had long been ignored. Employees in lower-level positions, including the cleaning staff, maintenance teams, and administrative support, received long overdue recognition, not only in financial terms, but in how their roles were acknowledged within the company. Meetings that had once been exclusive were expanded to include voices that had never been heard before. It was not about giving everyone control. It was about giving everyone presence. One of the most significant changes came in the form of open forums, structured gatherings where employees from every level could speak directly about their experiences, their concerns, and their ideas. Clara attended these sessions personally, not as a figure of authority, but as someone willing to listen. She did not interrupt. She did not dismiss. She asked questions when necessary, but more often she simply allowed people to speak. For many, it was the first time they had felt seen within the company. The transformation was not immediate, but it was undeniable. The tension that had once defined the workplace began to shift, replaced gradually by something more stable, something that did not rely on fear to function. Productivity did not decline as some had predicted. It improved not because people were pressured but because they were engaged. And as the weeks passed, the narrative surrounding Sterling and Rowe began to change, not just internally, but externally as well. Clara did not take credit for these changes. She did not present herself as a savior or a disruptor. She understood that what she had done was not extraordinary. It was necessary. The system had always had the capacity to function differently. It had simply lacked the willingness to do so. One afternoon as she walked through the office, she was approached by a junior analyst who hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether it was appropriate. He thanked her not for a specific decision but for the way the company felt different. Clara listened, her expression softening slightly, and then she responded in a way that reflected everything she had come to understand. She said that change does not come from one person. It comes from what people are willing to accept and what they are willing to challenge. And for the first time in a long time, Sterling and Rowe had begun to challenge itself. That was the real transformation. Not the removal of a CEO, not the shift in authority, but the redefinition of what the company chose to be moving forward. As the months passed, the story of Sterling and Rowe became something people talked about not because of scandal, but because of transformation. What had once been a company defined by quiet tension and unspoken hierarchy began to take on a different identity. One built on clarity, accountability, and a recognition that success did not have to come at the expense of the people who made it possible. Clara Bennett did not position herself at the center of that story, even though she could have. She did not seek attention, interviews, or recognition. Instead, she continued to move through the company with the same grounded presence she had always carried, focused not on how things looked, but on how they functioned. The difference now was that people saw her, not just as the woman who had changed the direction of the company, but as someone who had always been there, someone they had simply chosen not to notice. And that realization carried its own kind of weight, because it forced people to confront something deeper than a leadership change. It forced them to reconsider how often they overlooked value simply because it did not present itself in a way they expected. Clara did not speak often in large settings, but when she did, her words were measured and direct. In one of the company's open forums, she addressed a room filled with employees from every level, from entry positions to senior management. She spoke not about power but about perception. She explained that the most dangerous assumption any system can make is believing that importance is always visible, that influence always announces itself, that value always aligns with position. She reminded them that some of the most significant changes begin in places no one is paying attention to, carried by people no one thinks to listen to. The room remained silent as she spoke, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Because by that point her words were no longer theoretical. They were proven. Outside the company, the building itself looked exactly the same as it always had. A tall glass structure reflecting the skyline, unchanged in appearance. But inside everything was different. Not perfect, not without challenges, but grounded in something that had not existed before. Awareness. And that awareness extended beyond policies and procedures. It lived in the way people spoke to each other, the way decisions were questioned, the way silence was no longer accepted as the default response to uncertainty or concern. One evening, as the sun began to set and the light softened across the city, Clara stood for a moment near the same window she had once looked out of during her late shifts. The reflection staring back at her was familiar, not because it had changed but because it had always been this way. She had not become someone new. She had simply allowed what was already there to be seen. There was no dramatic ending, no final declaration, no need for one. The impact of what she had done would continue in ways that did not require her presence to sustain. That was the difference between control and influence. Control demands constant reinforcement. Influence continues long after the moment has passed. Clara turned away from the window, her steps steady as she moved toward the exit, not as someone leaving something behind, but as someone who had completed what needed to be done. And in that quiet transition, there was a message that extended far beyond the walls of Sterling and Row, that the people most often underestimated are not lacking in power. They are simply waiting for the moment when it matters most. That patience is not weakness, and silence is not absence. And that when clarity meets courage, even the most invisible presence can become impossible to ignore. If this story reminded you that strength does not always look the way we expect, take a moment to share it with someone who might need that reminder. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins with the decision to finally be seen.